Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We are working our way through the book of Joshua, and we just started last time, and so we are just a few chapters into it.
Yeah,
but it's getting exciting.
Yeah, it is actually. Yeah, and last week we talked about the background of the book, and we talked about it from a historical standpoint. I mean, this is a historical book, and it's all about getting the nation of Israel that's been wandering around the desert for 40 years into their land.
Yeah.
Right? But then we also saw where the Jewish nation considers this a prophecy book, not necessarily a historical book. So we talked about that a little bit, and the idea is when we think prophecy, myself and a lot of other people, is like, future events, revelation.
Yeah.
But and that is true, but
it can include that.
Yeah, more often than not, it's God talking to Moses, and we see God talking to Joshua a lot in here.
Yeah. In fact, our passage this week opens with a conversation, right?
Yeah. So that part's kind of cool. And then another thing you pointed out last week was, a lot of times people are like, well, it's not fair that the people that were in the promised land, had to leave. Yeah. And you bring up things like they knew. Yeah. and we see in Joshua that the people knew exactly what happened when Moses brought them out of Egypt and the Red Sea, and they were petrified that they were in the area. And that was 40 years.
Yeah, 40 years later. So
they had time to move.
They had lots of time to move. And the other thing is that God had already promised this tract of land to Abraham and his descendants.
Right.
And that was, let's say, 600 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's been a long
before
time.
Egypt, before all of this. So it's not like these guys just show up at the door and say, knock, knock, we're taking over now. Yeah. This was carefully orchestrated.
And even my God said, this is the same God that broke them out of Egypt, the same God that parted the Red Sea.
Yeah.
How many more miracles would you like to see?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they're going to see some more.
Actually, they are.
In case you were wondering.
Yeah. So this week, I think you pointed out there's 3 to 4 big things that happen. So what happens?
Yeah, we're going to pick up just the end of chapter 5, and then we're reading chapters 6, 7, and 8. And each chapter basically has one big thing, right? Yeah. Chapter 6 is that the destruction, the defeat of Jericho. And a lot of people, if you grew up in Sunday school or church or something, you sort of know that account, that historical narrative. Chapter 7, there is the defeat of Israel because of a sin.
Right.
And then in chapter 8, then they defeat one of their enemies again, the city or the town of Ai. And then they renew their covenant with God. So that's sort of like the big picture of where we're going this week.
Well, it's pretty much the whole history of Israel. And then we got right with God again. Move forward.
Defeat, restoration, defeat, restoration.
Well, I love the way this starts out. So Joshua and his army are camped near Jericho. They're getting ready for the war. And Joshua is hanging out, and he sees a guy. And the guy has his sword drawn. And Joshua, of course, asks him, "Hey, whose side are you on?
Friend or foe?
Yeah, whose side are you on?" Which is kind of an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And what's the guy say to him?
He says, "I am the commander of the Lord's army."
Yeah, the commander of the Lord's army. So Joshua had a choice, right? Is this being from God, or is it a trick, or whatever? And Joshua, I think because he had a strong enough relationship with God, took him at face value, and he bows down to this guy on the ground and says, "What does my master want to say to his servant?" Which is awesome line there. Yeah. So we got to go back because the big question is, who is the commander of the Lord's army?
Well, you've got in the New Testament, you've got Michael is an archangel who seems to be, leading a war at some point. But this time I think it's what's called a theophany, and specifically a Christophany. These are just fancy words. Theos means God. Christos is Christ. Phany, that Phany, is from the word that means to appear. So a theophany is an appearance of God. And a Christophany is an appearance of Christ. Right. So a lot of times we'll see Christ, the eternal Son, before he became Jesus, before he was born, right? referred to as like the angel of the Lord or the messenger of Jehovah or something. I think that's who this is. It's an appearance, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ.
Yeah, and I came up with a couple of reasons why, and I didn't come up with it. Just say I did.
I'm glad he's good to know. He's glad to know about that. About time somebody did.
Well, one is Joshua bows down to him on the ground, and generally when an angel appears, everybody's scared. They fall flat on the ground. The angel's like, "Whoa,
don't worship me."
Yeah,
right?
don't
yeah,
worship
don't bow
me.
down to me.
They say it every time.
Yeah.
It's not said here.
Yeah.
So that part's kind of interesting.
Yep.
He's also later told to remove his shoes. This is holy ground, kind of reminiscent of Moses.
Yeah.
Burning bush.
Which is really, that was Moses' commission. This is sort of Joshua's official commission.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the strongest argument.
Yeah.
Right.
Then the third thing, in Revelation, Jesus is leading the heavenly army.
Yeah.
So it is one of his functions.
When he comes back in Revelation 19, he comes back to set up his kingdom. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
he's leading the army. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jericho is so chapter 6 now, Jericho is under siege. Nobody goes in, nobody goes out. There would be walls, probably, guys on top of the walls. And God tells Joshua, I'm going to defeat these guys for you.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to do it. Here's the rules. Here's what you need to do. Now, if it wasn't God telling Joshua this, so God tells Joshua, here's what you're going to do. You're going to get your army out. They need to remain silent. You got to get the priests. You got to get the ark. Oh, by the way, the priests need some ram horns. They need to make a bunch of noise. And for 6 days, you're going to march around Jericho once each day.
And go back home.
Okay.
Without making any other noise except for the trumpets, right?
Yep. It's like, you see him writing down notes. Okay. And then on the 7th day, you're going to march around 7 times.
Yeah.
Still being quiet. And then on the 7th time, you, Joshua, are going to tell the warriors to let out a battle cry.
Yep.
And that's all that's needed. And it's like, wow.
Okay, then.
But if God's going to win a war for you, that's the way.
Well, he doesn't. I mean, the whole point is that he doesn't want them thinking they did anything, right?
Exactly.
Because marching around the wall, a couple of dozen times or a dozen times is not going to do anything.
Yeah. So one of the big questions is, how long did it take to march around?
So I did some research on this, and some people say, "Oh, it's 10 miles around." I'm like,
That's a long time.
yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Because you got once a day, which is okay, but 7 times.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to do that very well. Probably some more reliable sources that I found said that the city itself, within the walls, because they're going to have outliers and stuff, but within the walls was a maximum of maybe 8 to 10 acres. So if we say it's a 10-acre plot, that gives you a perimeter of about a half a mile. Now, the average person, if you and I were just walking and talking, we would walk somewhere between 2 and 3 miles an hour.
Right.
So a half a mile, easy. We could get 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever.
Right.
Marching that many people, I don't know how long it would take them, but easily be done in somewhere between a half hour and an hour, which does make Saturday or the 7th day a long day. Because even if it's a half hour, that's a 3.5 hour trek.
Yeah.
If it's an hour to get around, now it's 7 hours. So that does make that one a long day regardless. Yeah. But those first 6 days, march around for a half hour, an hour, and
take the rest of the day off.
Yeah, call it good.
Yeah. So God also had some other rules that he put into place, and that was Rahab. Right, so the 2 spies that went in and made a deal with Rahab, they needed to go back in, find her place, and escort everybody out of there. And I think the rule was, it had to have the red rope in the window so they could find it.
Yep.
And then everybody that needed to be under their protection needed to be in
that
there.
house, in that room,
Right.
whatever. Yeah,
right. So the spies go in. Spies would go in close to being first and bring everybody out. And of course, the Israeli army would know who the 2 spies were and grant them safe passage.
Yep.
But then everything in the city that breathes is going to be put to the sword.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why is that?
Because, and I think I mentioned this last time as well, but there are in Canaan, or there were in Canaan, lots of little groups, but then major strongholds. And the reason that God did not have Israel come in several hundred years earlier, they sort of parked in Egypt for 400 years, right? God told Abraham in Genesis 15, because the sin of the Amalekites has not yet reached its fullness. So while Israel was parked in Egypt and growing into a large group of people, 2-3 million people, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, all of these ites were getting more and more pagan and more demonic and more wicked until the fullness of their sin, they didn't repent, they didn't whatever, and God used Israel to judge them. So what happened is when they came into the land, there were certain places, only a handful, 7 I think. The Hebrew word is cherem, which means devoted to destruction. They were under God's divine curse, divine judgment. And in those places, everything had to be killed and burnt. Yep. All the other places, you could take the loot, you could, whatever.
Yeah, so that was another rule.
And that's a big deal, is that everyone had to be killed, every animal had to be killed, because you can't let this stuff stay in the land.
Right. So another rule was all silver, gold, bronze, and iron items belong to the Lord's treasury. And I think you'll see that 3 or 4 times in there. It's not like he just said it once and forgot about it, right? It's in there a bunch. And be careful, it would be annihilation and disaster for Israel if you take any of God's riches.
Any of it. God claimed it all.
Yep. And it's also a little foreshadowing.
Yeah, and it's also a reminder that, we find this later in the prophets, that Israel, the land of Israel, does not belong to the nation of Israel. God gave it to them as an inheritance, but God considers himself as the owner of the land. So it's almost like it's on lease to them or whatever. So all of the stuff that was in there, especially, so the people of Jericho, immensely wicked, immensely pagan, demon worshipers, the whole thing. When God destroyed them, he collected the booty.
Right.
The loot was all his because he won this battle. He overthrew the demon gods. Yeah. And you're not allowed to have any of it. I'm doing this purely by myself.
Yep. And then Joshua also made a declaration. Any man who attempts to rebuild the city is not going to have a fun time at all. Right? It's going to be, they're going to stand condemned before the God. The firstborn son will lose his life when the foundation of the city is laid, and when the city gates are erected, the youngest would die.
And that's actually happened a couple of times in history.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, but Jericho's been rebuilt.
Yeah, but the Jericho that we think of in Jesus' day and before and today, that's about a mile or so away from this Jericho, because people have tried to rebuild this one and it always ended in disaster. So they moved about a mile or so away and built another one.
I can rebuild yours. Yeah, I can rebuild it. Yeah.
Which, by the way, when you read in the Gospels, Jesus is entering Jericho or he's leaving Jericho, and it's like, but one Gospel writer says he's leaving Jericho, and another one says he's entering. And how's that work? Because he was actually leaving one and headed into another, even though one of them was a ruin.
Right.
So there were 2 right there next to each other, and you have to put that context when he's healing blind men and everything.
Right. Into, out of.
Out of. Yeah. That's why. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Jericho falls. They put everybody to the sword. And maybe, just maybe, somebody steals some stuff that they shouldn't have done.
Just maybe.
And what we're going to find out is Israel as a nation is condemned. Because of it. So one man sinned.
Punished, maybe is. Condemned might be a little strong, but definitely punished.
Yeah. Because of one man's misdeeds.
Because of one man's sin, he stole from God.
Right. Well, you can see the guy and his family having problems. But so what happens with the nation of Israel is that we move on. They send out spies to the next city, and the next city is literally spelled A-I, and you call that I?
Some people pronounce it AI. I pronounce it I. Because it's a sort of a diphthong. But yeah.
You figure 2 letters we ought to be able to figure out how to should have some agreement on. So the spies go to the city. They come back and say, 3,000.
Easy.
We only need 3,000 guys and we can take it. So they send out 3,000. They're gone.
Trounced.
Yeah, they're gone.
Yeah.
And the nation of Israel says their courage melts away. Now, they know what's going on, or they somewhat know what's going on, right? Joshua's tearing his clothes. Then he prays to God.
Yeah. God
what's the
just
deal?
did this huge defeat in Jericho.
Yep.
This one should be an easy one. It's not on the list of, utter destruction, the whole thing.
Yeah,
what happened?
And God tells him exactly what happened. Israel, you stole my riches.
Yep.
You stole what was mine. So he then says you have to remove the contamination.
Yeah.
And I won't go into it, but there's an interesting story on how they find the family.
Yep.
And the person.
Well, the guy had taken the stuff and brought it into his tent, into his home, and buried it.
Yeah.
Right? He knew it was wrong.
Yep.
He knew he wasn't
And he
supposed
was
to do it.
hiding it.
He was hiding it, the whole thing, and he was hoping that he wouldn't get caught. And then they lose to this, this little nothing village.
Yeah.
And now he's got problems. But your question was one guy affects. I mean, how many
3,000
guys
died because of one guy.
Yeah.
Right.
The thing we have to remember about Israel, and this is not the same with the church, the thing we have to remember about Israel is that God promised blessings and curses and gave them covenants as a nation. It was an all or nothing deal. And with Jericho, he said, I'm going to do this. You follow these instructions. He upheld his end of the bargain. He said, all of this stuff is mine.
And the nation of Israel didn't.
And as a nation, because he looks at them as a nation, they didn't. Because of one guy. Now, that does not play over directly into, if one person in our church sins, it doesn't, the whole church doesn't get punished or whatever because of it. But when we sin, it always affects more than just us, right? It always affects other people around. Right. And the more responsibility we have, the different offices that we have, the more people that we influence, the more that
there's even a
generation
of sin, or a sin can affect generations.
Yeah.
Generational sin?
Yeah, it can.
Okay, so they find the guy, they dig up the stuff, they bring it back, they bring the guy and all the stuff to an appropriate named place called the Valley of Disaster. All of Israel stones him to death along with his family, and they burn everything, cover it up with rocks, and the Lord's anger subsides.
Essentially what they did to him and his family and belongings is the same thing that they did to Jericho.
Right.
He aligned himself with Jericho, basically stood against God. I'm going to do what I want to do. I want to take this stuff for myself. So in a sense, he was aligning himself with Jericho. So he got the same
which is the
punishment as Jericho, and then Israel was purged, and now they could move forward.
Right. So now they're right with God again, and God says, take the whole army against the same town. Do what you did to Jericho, except, this time the rules are a little bit different. You can plunder some things that you couldn't before. And oh, by the way, set an ambush behind the city. It's just like as an afterthought. Right?
Yeah.
They say that. So there's great detail on how it happened. Won't go into the whole thing. But one thing that we haven't talked about recently is how big is this army? I mean, they're taking the whole Israeli army at that point in time against this city. So how many guys are we talking about?
Well, if we go based on the numbers in Numbers, in the book of Numbers opens with a census before the 40 years of wandering, closes with a census after the 40 years, because they were counting, the purpose of the census was to figure out how big of an army do we have. And so they counted all the men from 20 years and older who could serve.
Right.
except for the Levites, because the Levites never served in the army.
Right.
At the beginning, when they first came out of Egypt, it was 603,000 and change. At the end, they had lost a couple of thousand as that generation died off. 601,000 and change. So we're talking an army of about 600,000 people.
So if the whole army marched against Jericho, you got 600,000 people. They may have taken up the whole perimeter.
When they ran into each other, it's like, can we just go home now?
It was a half hour to walk around it, but it was more than a half hour to get to the back of the line, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. It was further than that to get back to camp, right? It was.
Right.
So but let's not forget though that this was at least 40 years ago a nation of slaves. These were not warriors.
Yeah, right.
So you can call them an army.
Right.
But I mean, this wasn't like some well-trained, well-oiled machine type thing.
Yeah, I don't know that we know how big Aya is. What I read in the commentary was 12,000.
Yeah. At the end,
that's true.
Yeah. Toward the end of chapter 8, it says, but that was the whole town. That was women and children, or women anyway. At least it says 12,000 men and women died that day, including all the men of Ai. So there's probably more women, more children, whatever.
Well, it also makes sense why they said 3,000. So it wasn't 3 against 12,000. When you pare it down, it would have been maybe 3,000 males.
Yeah.
Okay. Either way, significantly outnumbered. But it was kind of cool the way they did it, because it seems like they approached the way they did before with a much smaller army. Mm-hmm. Hey, let's fight kind of deal. The army came out. The Israeli army kind of backs off, and
we're gonna beat them again.
Yeah, right, and then keeps drawing them out, and then the main part of the army just takes over the city, and it wasn't a fight at all. The warriors finally wake up, turn around, and see their city being burned, and by that time they realize they're surrounded too, and it's game over for them.
If you like military and you like strategy and stuff, this is a really neat chapter because there really is some neat detail in this chapter 8.
Yeah, so at this point, Israel now has a significant foothold in the promised land. They don't have everything. There's still definitely more work to do, but they got a foothold.
Yep.
Now they have to do something special.
Yeah.
That Moses said they needed to do.
Yeah.
So
back in Deuteronomy, before Moses died, he told this same generation, because this is the second generation now, he told this generation, when you get into the land, there are 2 mountains, and one of them we're going to designate the mountain of blessing, and the other one we're going to designate the mountain of cursing.
Right.
I think more curses than cursing, right? But I want half of you to be on each mountain, and you're going to call out to each other the blessings and the curses based on the law. Because God says this, if you obey the law, I will bless you, and I'll bless you in all these ways. And you can go in Deuteronomy 28 and see a lot of this stuff. If you disobey, I'm going to curse you in all these ways. And it's really interesting because he says, I'm going to give you sickness and I'm going to give you pestilence. If you keep going, I'm going to do this and you do this and this, all the way down to if you just won't repent, I'll kick you out of this land. I brought you into this land. I can take you out of this land, which is exactly what happens. But then in Deuteronomy 30, God gives this promise. After I kick you out of this land, because I know I'm going to, I promise I will bring you back. And we call that the land covenant that ultimately will be fulfilled in the millennium. They will finally be back in the land. Yeah. God himself will be their king. It'll finally be everything that God has always designed for it to be with Israel. Hasn't happened yet. It's still future. But Deuteronomy 28 through 30 is what they're commemorating here. And so they do exactly what Moses told them to do. They go in, they yell at each other, blessings and curses, and renew the covenant with God. Yeah,
so Joshua also reads the law.
Yeah.
Is that going to be the 10 Commandments? Is that going to be
the
whole
articles? No, it's the whole thing because you have to, as a nation, remember this is covenant with a nation. They have to obey everything that was written in the law, not just the Big Ten.
Right.
If they're going to get the blessings. And if they don't obey those things, they'll get the curses.
And this is also what we talked about last week, where he needed to keep it. keep it near him, and whether it was physically on him or not, but the words had to be coming out of his mouth, and he had to know it and understand it. And one way to do that is to read it.
Yeah, so there was the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments are in the Ark, but then there's the whole thing is written down elsewhere.
Well, and he's supposed to write it down too, right? Or does that come later?
Well, kings were supposed to write it down, but they had I'm sure they had copies of it.
Right. So that's where we end today. So now we find the nation of Israel has a very strong foothold. Definitely the surrounding areas are scared to death, and we'll see things that they do.
They don't have a city yet because they just burnt the last two. So they're still camping in tents, But
that's all they've ever done.
Yeah, but imagine now you're the people around and you see 2-3 million people out there. And you hear what happened to Jericho, and nobody does that to Jericho unless historically, they've seen nations do that, but we're talking strong armies, nothing like this.
Right.
And Ai is gone, and now you thought they were scared before?
Yeah. Well, and it also gives people reason to leave.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is the point. God is trying to push them out, clear the land, and sadly, some will stay and try to fight.
Yeah. Well, and next week we'll see a group that takes a different approach.
Yeah.
Let's just say that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Yeah. We'll save that till next week in chapter 9. Until then, as you have questions and comments and insights and your own feedback, we'd love to hear those. Share this with people that you think would find this interesting and helpful in their spiritual lives. And we will see you back here next time.
Bye, everybody.